spiritual death is not something unpleasant. It might sound, it's a pity we have that word, actually, spiritual death. It doesn't sound nice, does it? If I asked how many people are really appetized, they said that's what they want today. They might not be very a big show of hands. Actually, there are various ways of talking about what this really means. One of the ones I really like is what Kamala Sheila once said. He said, spiritual death is the collapse of the structures of ignorance deep within consciousness. And that's something I really like, and that's really stayed with me. In the samsaric state, the unenlightened state, there are all sorts of beliefs, views, ways of relating, you name it, that keep us in the unsatisfactory state. What spiritual death means is that we start to see through these things and they start to fall away, or at least loosen their grip, If you have a very powerful spiritual death, it can mean some structures are actually left dead in the water ever after, but that's rare, but it does happen. There are some people who have such a deep insight that it actually does leave the delusion of self, fixed self, dead in the water ever after, but that's quite rare. What tends to happen as we do the sort of things we're going to do in the second half is you start to see through the delusion that things and ourselves are fixed. And so something at least starts to loosen. And that already is a great blessing. It's not that there is a me here, but then with spiritual death, something collapses and turns into a nothing. Now, the way Vasantra once put this is that you cannot destroy something that never existed in the first place. So what that means is that in the unenlightened state, there's a delusion that this thing we call me is something fixed and substantial. That's not the real nature of things. We'll come on to this more in the second half. So it's not as though there's a me that exists, but then when we have this spiritual death experience, it's going to unfortunately be crushed. All that goes with spiritual death is the deluded belief about the nature of the self. And all that does is it frees you up. As the Buddha famously once said, just as the waters of the great oceans have but one taste, the taste of salt, so this doctrine, this discipline, has but one taste, the taste of liberation. So that's all that's happening with spiritual death, is that the deluded beliefs that keep us in a state of suffering, they are let go of. And that's just a very liberating thing. Sometimes it's quite good to see if one can do various things to give oneself to sort of connect with the flavour of what this would mean. So one of the things you can do is you could just ask yourself, I wonder, you can allow yourself occasionally to have a fantasy. What might happen if some of these deluded constricting beliefs deep within consciousness, how might I be if they fell away or at least loosened? You can also ask yourself, have there been times, and I guarantee there will have been times, when at least for a while, the deluded aspects of consciousness were a bit weaker, a bit less. The barriers were down a bit, and more spontaneity, more freedom and positivity had room to emerge. When it comes to what we're talking about, spiritual death, there will always be precedents in our experience. It might be a time when you were just, I don't know, on holiday or something, wandering through the countryside, and some of the usual defences and need to cling on to certain views might at least have just sort of subsided, at least for a while. Now, even if that happens, it gives you a little taste of what we're going towards with these practices. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was thinking, what could one say that at least gives an intimation, gives a flavour of what we're talking about with spiritual death? And one of the things that occurred to me is you wouldn't have to keep maintaining an image in relation to others. I know when I'm talking to people, I always want to keep a certain image. I don't want to see them and see me as weak or incompetent or whatever. And actually that need to maintain a certain image and sort of maintain a certain reputation is a very boring and very strenuous. If you start to undergo spiritual death, the collapse of these structures of ignorance that believe that something's fixed about this and separate and has to defend itself and has a certain relationship with other fixed selves. When you start to see through this, then the need to maintain that image and reputation it starts to fall away. It doesn't mean you can't behave sensibly so that people don't think you're nuts. It doesn't mean you can't maintain a reputation if it's useful, but you don't have to cling to that. There isn't a whole load of emotional energy invested in the identification, and that is that's a great thing as well. Another thing that occurred to me when I was thinking, what can I say that gives a sort of flavour of what we're talking about with spiritual death? And that was a very wise man who practiced in another tradition other than Buddhism. He'd done Sufism for decades. And he once said to me, if you're totally undefended, you can't be knocked over. I said, yeah, actually, I think you're right. I think it is a bit of an irony. And he said, it's absolutely an irony. Something I suppose paradoxical would be the better word. But the image that came to mind when I was reflecting on that is somebody firing an arrow, and instead of being something like this, I was perfectly okay to put a shield up. I would put a shield up if somebody fired an arrow and had a shield. But the image was of the arrow just going straight through. It's as though there's nothing to engage with. And so, yeah, I love that. If you're totally undefended, you can't be knocked over. That gives a bit of a flavour of what would be if one were to let go of these deluded beliefs about the nature of the self. And one thing that would also happen is you wouldn't then need to keep trying to push away unpleasant experiences, and you wouldn't keep trying to grasp onto the pleasant experiences. And that's a blessing as well. I'm sure we've all had times when something has been more constricted and more grasping and more identified, and times when we've been able to some degree let go. When you let go a bit, you can allow experiences to arise and pass. You don't have to defend against a potential unpleasant experience. You don't have to grasp onto what is pleasant. And instead of making experience weaker, it actually makes it richer. So I'm sure most people have heard Blake's famous little lines, he who binds to himself for joy does the winged life destroy. But he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So that expresses in a lovely way what it is when one lets go of grasping identity and clinging and can just let reality be, allow experiences to arise and pass as they do.